My father was a pastor at the local church in Wales. Being a pastor, he had so many responsibilities, but he was alone, and his first wife left him early when he couldn't just give them the time he wanted to, and it was very difficult in the beginning to deal with it. But as the time went by, we got more and more separated from everything. He was getting alone, and then he decided to not be that anymore. And he wanted to get married again, but to find a girl of the appropriate age for him was a task. But just in time, there was a person, a stranger that moved into town a month ago and was very frequent to the Sunday sermons. Her name was Helen. I knew Helen from the first day that she moved in the town. She said she was a nomad and she barely stopped at a place. I met her in the local salon where she was working, and I told her about my father being the sermon and being one of the most respectable members in the society, and she was pretty impressed by it. We were quick to be friends after that. We would hang out together a lot, and that was when I told her everything about my family, and she was very keen on knowing all about us. Our relationship was a bit different, and people just wouldn't understand it, so we never disclosed it. She and I got very close, but then I stopped seeing her because that was the only appropriate thing to do. And then I found out that my father sent the marriage proposal to the woman, and weirdly that the woman accepted it, knowing the things between us. So I decided not to overthink it and roll with whatever was happening. They met, and things were decided between them, and the council worked out things where they decided the event of all the things, and he was to wed the woman in the same church. I was very skeptic of the woman, mostly because in all the days that I knew her, there was something about her that was distinct from the others, almost as if she did not know about her existence. She claimed to be a nomad, but all the places she talked about mostly sounded like Latin, and the places she talked about rarely existed. Just days before the wedding, she hesitated and asked my father if they can get married outside the church in the garden. She did not want to do that indoors, and something about being closer to God is to be with trees and rather the stones. I guess things like these really infatuated my father about her. One morning while I was sitting and trying to arrange the flowers, she came towards me and said, "I might going to be your new stepmother, but let us not forget that we are friends first and then everything else." And I agreed and smiled. I guess we both had mutual respect and trust between us, and that is the reason we'll synced well, and while my father was pretty happy that it wasn't an issue for me. The wedding happened, and it was a great event, and everyone was pretty excited and happy. And then around a month later, there were the bitter bickering between both of them that started, and I used to stay as far away as I can from their matter. She was getting weirder every day, and that was blacker than she was wearing, and would deny any sermon, saying that she is tired of hearing my father talk about God. We were just sitting having our evening tea when she told me, "He isn't that great, you know, the God." And I wondered what she was on about. And then she said to me, "I'm going to share a secret with you. When I said I'm a nomad, I meant in the realms. I roam from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead to the realm of the nothingness. And when I curse someone and kill them, they don't go to the realm of the dead. They go to the realm of nothingness. I am trying to build that realm, and I am going to be the queen, and you are going to be the king. When in the full moon I drench out the blood of your father, I shall marry you, and we shall drink the blood of your father to unionize, and then we cross over this realm and rule it together." I looked at her in worry and said, "Are you all right?" She was adamant on making me believe her, and I told her, "You don't want to visit the loony bin, do you?" She looked at me, grinding her teeth, and said, "Let me show you. I will stab myself and prove you that I am the nomad between the realms." And as she reached for the knife, I held her hand, stopped her, and said, "It's okay, I believe you." And then later she smiled, almost as if I had agreed with everything she had said. So I decided to tell my father everything, and told him that we should get her to a doctor of the mind to get her checked out. I decided to take her, and then there must have been a full noon night when I decided to take her with me, and I told her that we can start the sermon she wanted to and first buy some things. My father was right there. Her hairs were all covering her face, and she was wearing everything black, and she started talking gibberish. And that is when she started charging my father with a knife. and then to take her down, just swished a punch that threw her off guard. I had to. I wasn't very proud of that, but I had to. She was unconscious, and then we took her to the mind doctor where he diagnosed her with personality disorder and said that it is better she stays there because the switches can be unpredictable and it can be dangerous for her. 3 days after we dropped her there, they told us that she killed herself by asphyxiating herself, and I wondered how she could have done that. I went there to get the body, and they said that it disappeared. I did not believe in them and wondered a foul play. I went back to tell my dad, who was broken by the news, only to find out that my dad was lying dead in his own pool of blood, and she was standing over the body, her black robe flaring in air, and she extended her hand and said, "Come, my king." Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. For decades now, those huddled around their campfires on dark Virginia nights have shared a tale that has made their companions blood run cold. Is the story of an escaped insane asylum patient, a man committed for the cold-blooded murder of his own family on Easter Sunday. Following his incarceration, he became obsessed with Easter-modified motifs, eggs, crucifixes, and most importantly, rabbits. Because following his freak escape from the psychiatric hospital, he was interred at our family killer escape into the woods around Colchester Overpass near Clifton, Virginia, where he found his only stable resource of food was rabbit meat. Over time, the escaped mental patient collected the skins of the rabbit he killed, somehow stitching them together in something that resembled a huge gore-stained rabbit costume. Anyone unlucky enough to stray into his patch of the woods found themselves subjected to the terrifying ordeal of being chased to the trees by an axe-wielding fursuited psychopath that soon came to be known as the Bunnyman. But despite the fact that the Bunnyman sounds like nothing but bone-chilling urban legend, the terrifying reality is there's much more truth in the story than we'd like to admit. Clifton wasn't always the vibrant suburban sprawl that it is now. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was a small and humble farming community centered around the towns of the railway station. But as Clifton grew and its population swelled, the residents became unhappy that they were so close to a state insane asylum. The solution was simple. The local government passed a measure to shut the asylum down, and the inmates being temporarily housed in the newly built Lorton prison. However, during transport, one inmate managed to wrestle free from prison guards and escape into some nearby woodland. The prisoner's name was Douglas Griffin. In a matter of record that a man by the name was convicted of murder by his own parents with an axe on Easter morning when he was just 12 years old. And his hearing, young Douglas seemed manic and deranged, completely absorbed by the Easter imagery present in his home on the day he killed his own mother and father. A judge spared no time and committed him to an insane asylum, and that's where he lived for 20 long years, right up until the day of his escape. Federal marshal, local law enforcement, and a handful of volunteers searched the woods near the site of Griffin's escape for months on end, using sniffer dogs, professional trackers, and even mounted patrols. But the only traces they found the FEM were the mutilated corpses of several half-eaten rabbits. By October of that year, Douglas Griffin was assumed dead, with law enforcement refusing to believe that he could have survived out in the woods for that long. But after 3 teenagers went missing, the search for them brought police officers right back to the very same area they've been hunting Douglas Griffin. And then one night, bloodhounds looking for the kids led officers to a small bridge with a rail line at the top and a road running under the bridge. Hanging from the bridge were the missing teens' decision bowed like the rabbits in the woods. The teens had apparently been walking home and had stumbled across Griffin hiding under the bridge. Moments after making the gruesome discovery, police officers heard a maniacal laughter coming from above them. Looking up to see a man in a rabbit's fur mask waving an axe above his head. Police then claimed that Griffin was hit by an oncoming train, although whether or not that's true or just an excuse for their failure to capture him, it's impossible to discern. But that didn't stop local newspapers from pumping out stories detailing the grisly deeds of the Bunnyman of Clifton. As far as I can tell, the Bunnyman legend appears to have started in the 1970s, but has its roots in unrelated real-life events. On the night of October 8, 1970, Air Force Cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée were driving near Colchester Bridge when Robert spotted something in the middle of the road that had him slamming on his brakes to avoid hitting it. There was a man, and what appeared to be a full-bodied gray suit on there was completely, with as Robert put it, something that looked a lot like bunny ears. The couple simply stared at the figure, dumbstruck, until they noticed the large hatchet in his hand, at which point they drove off again at high speed. Though neither Robert nor his fiancée were hurt, they were shaken by the incident and couldn't provide a lot of details. But with his pale outfits and ear-like head covering, Benetton police initially speculated that the man was a member of the KKK. The mysterious figure was quickly dubbed the Bunnyman by local newspapers, and it wasn't long before there was a second sighting. Less than 2 weeks later, a construction site security guard making his rounds in a new housing development caught the Bunnyman using an axe to smash the roof supports of new houses being built. After the newspaper ran the story, the Bunnyman called the local authorities, saying that he was against the spread of new housing divisions into his woods. Based on his voice and eyewitness accounts, police determined the Bunnyman was a local teen upset with the new housing development. He told police that he would meet them at the Colchester Bridge on Halloween, but never showed it was never seen again. The events were reported in the newspaper around the country, and teens from all over Virginia started to make their way to Colchester Bridge to look for the Bunnyman. Over 50 Bunnyman sightings were reported everywhere, from Maryland to Washington, D.C., though not a single sighting could be corroborated. The supernatural elements of the Bunnyman story only came when locals connected the Bunnyman news reports to an unsolved murder of a local girl that happened in 1918. 14-year-old Eva Roy was found beaten to death and hung near Colchester Bridge, and the prime suspect was an escaped mental patient who broke out of Lorton Prison, though he was eventually proved innocent of the crime. As years passed, the legend spread. Teens near the bridge would go on Bunnyman hunts in the woods, especially near Halloween. It seems horrifying that such a ridiculous-sounding story can have so many elements of truth to it. Just makes you wonder, how many other stories, myths, or legends that we're so quick to dismiss as false are actually based on terrifying, real-life events? In the early 20th century, Markia Sarenko escaped from her home country of Russia, feeling the bloodthirsty Bolsheviks who were in the process of turning their native land into the political wasteland that was the USSR. She escaped over the border to China, who at the same time had yet to be consumed by communism as a temporary stopover on her way to the United States. However, it was in China that the superstitious Maria consulted a fortune teller, wishing to get a good idea of what her journey had in store for her. The Chinese fortune teller gave Maria some very good news indeed, telling her that not only would she successfully make it to the United States, but that she would give birth to a daughter, whose beauty would become globally renowned. But that under all circumstances, she should avoid so-called dark waters. Then, after making it all the way to San Francisco, Maria gave birth to a daughter on July 20th, 1938, naming her Natalia Nikolaevna Zarenko. Natalia would gain the fame that the fortune teller had predicted, but would be known by another name entirely. That name was Natalie Wood. Natalie's mother essentially groomed her for stardom from the time she learned to walk and talk. She sent her to singing, dancing, and acting lessons, training her to be a complete triple threat, before parading her around movie studios in the hopes that she would be discovered, and thus fulfill her destiny. It was such an intensive experience that it verged on abuse. Natalia's mother was utterly ruthless and unforgiving, separating her from her sister and even denying her medical assistance for injuries in the instance that this would only make her stronger. Maria paid close attention to the prophetic warnings of the fortune teller, too, and made an effort to give Natalia a deep ingrained fear of deep water. Yet, despite her efforts, the fortune teller's predictions almost came true on the set of a movie called The Green Promise. During shooting, a young Natalie was set to run across a bridge that was set to collapse during a rainstorm, a bridge that just so happened to run over a pool of rough, dark water. The director insisted that the timing would be just right, and although there would be an element of on-screen peril, she would be entirely safe, but terrifyingly enough, one of the set stuff happened to pull the collapse mechanism too early, and Natalie broke her wrist as she fell into the water. Her mother was distraught, believing she was about to see the prophecy of drowning come true before her very eyes. But the set staff, acting quickly, helped Natalie pull herself to safety as she struggled to do so with a broken wrist. If she wasn't terrified of water beforehand, she certainly was then. Maria refused to get her daughter any medical assistance for the broken wrist either, believing that an insistence on doing so would deter directors from hiring her in the future. The injury scarred her wrist so heavily that Natalie went on instead on covering the scars with multiple bracelets for the rest of her life. Not only because she believed the wound was ugly, because it reminded her of one of the most traumatic instances of her life, so traumatic that she never, ever learned to swim, and was reported to have panic attacks whenever she tried to wash her hair. Despite her traumas, Natalie had a long and successful film career, and will go on to wed fellow star Robert Wagner. They had a rocky relationship, and naturally got divorced and remarried before having their one and only daughter, Natasha. Then, during Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, Natalie Roberts and another movie star, Christopher Walken, were enjoying some rest and relaxation aboard Wagner's yacht, named the Splendor, around the Catalina Island off the coast of California. Only one other person was with them, the boat's captain, a man named Dennis Davern. They spent the weekend shopping, sunning themselves, sailing, dining out, and profusely drinking on the night of November 27, 1981, after yet another evening of heavy drinking. An argument between Natalie and Robert broke out when it grew so intense that Natalie demanded that Captain Davern take her ashore on the small dinghy that was kept on board the Splendor. The pair then spent the night in a hotel before returning to the boat the following morning, when Natalie and Robert apparently talked things out and buried the hatchet. The following night, Robert, Natalia, Captain Davern, and Christopher Walken went ashore to dine in a restaurant called Doug's Harbor Reef. Here, they continued their stint of heavy drinking, reportedly ordering 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and numerous daiquiris, was one of the waiting staff reporting that they barely touched their food. The proper people were so intoxicated that the restaurant manager reportedly called harbor security to ensure that they made it back to the boat safely that night. According to Captain Davern, Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken argued violently over politics, as well as the direction that Natalie's career should take. He has since stated that the argument grew so violent that one of the men threw an empty wine bottle at the other before Natalie had to get involved to separate the pair. The argument then shifts to one between Natalie and Robert, with Natalie apparently telling Robert that she'd had enough before retiring to her room for the night at around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, on November 29th of 1981, a ship-to-shore call was made from the Splendor, one in which Captain Davern reported to the U.S. Coast Guard that Natalie Wood was missing. A search begins, one that ended just a few hours later at around 8 a.m. when Natalie Wood's drowned body is found floating near the ship's inflatable dinghy, the very same one she had used to escape the boat just 2 days prior. She was wearing nothing but a nightgown, a pair of socks, and a jacket. The autopsy showed that she had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, almost double the legal limit for driving. There was also evidence that she had taken a rather large amount of powerful painkillers, and the time before her death. She was just 43 years old when she passed away. Amazingly, on the day she died, Robert Wagner is not intensively questioned by police. It's only a few days later that the 3 men who were on the boat that night are brought in for questioning, and when they are each tells us suspiciously similar stories that details the evening's events. As a result, Natalie's death was assumed to be nothing more than an accidental drowning. The nation was dumbstruck by such a horrible, unforeseeable tragedy, and mourned in tandem with Robert Wagner, who went on to raise their 2 daughters as a single parent. 2 daughters who are almost inconsolable, distraught at the sudden death of their beloved mother. Natalie's death seemed to remain an open and shut case for an entire 30 years, until a shocking revelation turned public attention back onto the situation. Captain Dennis Davern, the man who had been captaining the Splendor that night, broke his silence on the case and came forward to state that he had in fact lied to the investigating law enforcement. The nation was shocked to hear that the argument that night between Walken and Wagner had not actually been rooted in politics, but the suspicion that Walken had been secretly flirting with Natalie whenever Robert Wagner's back was turned. As was previously mentioned, the argument then shifted to one between Wagner and Natalie after Walken that retired to his room. But then, when Natalie had tried to do the same and retire to bed, Robert Wagner had followed her to continue the argument. Then, sometime later, Wagner stormed up to Captain Davern, sweating and panicking, and told him to turn off all the boat's lights and ignore all onshore calls that came into the boat. In the aftermath, Davern claimed that Wagner kept him confined to his quarters in order to prevent him from giving a statement to the police, then held an impromptu meeting in which he ordered Walken and Davern to keep quiet about the arguments and to essentially give false statements to the police. In light of such statements, police reopened the investigation into Natalie Wood's death in the year 2012. A re-examining of the information gleaned from her autopsy had one corner declaring that she had died as a result of drowning, but also from other undetermined factors. Then, in 2018, Wagner was officially named as a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. Natalie's sister Alana came out and gave a media interview, stating that she believed Captain Davern's claims to be true, and had even confronted Wagner on the day of Natalie's funeral in an attempt to get him to reveal what had actually happened that night. This culminated in an appearance on the popular TV show Dr. Fell, in which Lena and Davern publicly accused Wagner of being solely responsible for Natalie's death. However, Lana was keen to make it clear that she didn't believe it to be outright murder, and that she didn't believe Wagner ever really intended to kill his wife, but either because lost in his rage during a heat-in-the-moment decision, possibly denying Natalie help when she had fallen into the water while trying to leave the boat to go ashore, just as she had done just 2 nights previous. Despite the accusations from her sister, Natalie's 2 daughters, Natasha and Courtney, stand by their father's version of events, saying he had done all he could to preserve the mother's legacy. Courtney is not even Robert's biological daughter, but adores him so much that she has even taken on his surname, potentially is a sign of loyalty and respect. She personally believes and has publicly stated that Captain Davern is a fabricator, one who simply wishes to make a name for himself, exploiting her mother's death for monetary gain, and these claims do carry some weight to them. For example, Davern not only took 30 years to come forward with his accusations, but was also, by his own admission, extremely drunk on the night in question. His story is apparently changed multiple times throughout the years, leaking seedy gossip to tabloid journalists the entire time. He had also written a book about the events of the night in question, one which has been analyzed and debunked by numerous people who asserted that Davern's version of events are extremely spurious. When asked about Devon's claims, Robert's biological daughter, Natasha, was reportedly said he is somebody who I cannot even dignify with a response because he is so undignified. As for Christopher Walken, the only other person aboard the Splendor that evening, he hasn't spoken much at all about the incident, keeping suspiciously quiet over the years. When asked about how he felt regarding the reopening of the case, he reportedly said, "I don't know," having previously said that he firmly believed Natalie's death to be a tragic accident. In conclusion, it's not entirely out of the question that an extremely intoxicated Natalie might have tried to use the very same dinghy she had used a few nights previous, and doing so, she could have simply fallen into the water and drowned while the other people on board were either too drunk to respond to her cries or simply below deck and unable to hear her entirely. Yet, it's also scarcely feasible that a jealous husband had discovered her infidelities, either perceived or real, thrown her into the sea in a rage, and simply used his influence or outright threats to cover up the murder. It has been 39 years since Natalie's tragic death, and we are still no closer to knowing the entire truth as to what happened to her that night. And it's not only her family and friends that deserve concrete answers, but society as a whole. Have we had a murderer walking among the Hollywood elite for the past 40 years or so? Or has an innocent man been subjected to a campaign of slander when he should have been given room to heal? Whatever happened that Thanksgiving weekend, one thing is painfully clear, that the dark prophecy told to Maria Zakharhenko by the Chinese fortune teller in the early 20th century did actually come true. And it was indeed dark waters that became the undoing of the young woman who came to be known to the world as Natalie Wood.